Part 3, Chapter 19. The helicopter rose off the pad and headed east toward Lake Union and the major bridges. It was the wrong way, and I knew it. There hadn't been enough time for the Tiny Dancer to sail into Lake Washington. The boat would be in the cut or still out on Puget Sound. We should be going west, I shouted to the man. Just look, he said, pointing to my binoculars, so I looked. White sails dotted the lake, powerboats cutting between them. The copter flew low toward the I-5 bridge. See anything? The man shouted. I shook my head. They couldn't have gotten here, I said again. There hasn't been enough time. We need to go west. Are you sure? He said. I'm sure. The man shouted to the pilot. The pilot looked at me. West, I yelled. West. The pilot shrugged, then turned the copter around and headed west. I kept remembering what my dad had said about the Ballard Locks. Was that the terrorist target? On a sunny day like this, there would be hundreds of people leaning over the railing watching the boats pass through, and more people on board the boats tied side by side in the locks. Finally, we were over the locks. The sailboats were so close to one another that it was almost impossible to read the names. We hovered overhead. People pointed skyward, puzzled and excited by our presence. Once I thought I saw my father, but then two little boys wearing orange life preservers came on deck and waved to me. Anything? The man shouted. No, I shouted. You sure? We could stay longer. I'm sure. The copter rose in the air and headed out over Puget Sound. Chapter 20. I've lived near the Sound my whole life, so I know it's big, but I never realized how big it was until that moment. The pilot shouted something to the man sitting next to me, who turned to me. Which direction? Which direction? I had no idea. It would be a guess, nothing more. And if I guessed wrong, then it came to me. South led to the city of Olympia and land. North led to the Strait of Juan de Fuca and out into the Pacific Ocean. That's where my dad would go. North, I shouted to the man. Head north. The man nodded and the copter banked right. Within a minute we were over Shoalsholm Marina. I raised the binoculars to my eyes and looked down. Police cars blocked off the entire marina. A line of fire trucks clogged the street in front. SWAT team members were walking up and down Pier B. The whole thing was unreal. It couldn't be happening, but it was. I felt a nudge. Look for the boat, kid. That brought me back. The man would point, and I'd focus the binoculars on sailboat after sailboat. No, no, no. It was hopeless and pointless. The old guys who combed the beach with their metal detectors, hoping to find a diamond ring, had a better chance of finding what they were looking for than we did. Puget Sound was too big. The Tiny Dancer was too little. The radio crackled. I couldn't make out much of what the pilot was saying, but I could pick up the excitement in his voice. What is it? I said. What is it? I said to the man next to me. What happened? There's a boat sailing erratically. It passed right under the prow of a freighter, and now it's headed north in the wrong traffic lane. My dad wouldn't do that. He might if he's trying to attract attention. The helicopter dipped and then headed northwest toward Kingston. Below and ahead, I could see a patrol boat racing in the same direction as we were. The men in the boat were armed with rifles. There! This time it was the pilot shouting and pointing. There! My hands were trembling so much from cold and from fear that it was hard to bring the binoculars into focus on the boat, but finally I did. Standing at the wheel of the sailboat was my dad. That's him, I shouted. That's my dad. A strange calm came over me. It was all going to be okay. Nothing had happened, and nothing would happen. The Coast Guard or the Port Police or whoever was in the powerboat below us would intercept the Tiny Dancer. They'd capture the terrorists, my dad would be fined, and nobody would get hurt. If I ended up in jail, that would be okay, just as long as nothing terrible happened. The copter pilot nudged the man next to me and then looked north. I followed his eyes and saw the Norwegian Sky, a huge luxury liner that carries at least 1,000 passengers, and the calm that had filled me dissolved. The Norwegian Sky was less than a half mile from the Tiny Dancer, and the two vessels were on a collision course. What's your dad doing? The man next to me shouted. I looked back to the Tiny Dancer. My dad had left the wheel and was taking in all the sail. The two men were on the deck pointing guns at him. I could tell they were screaming at him and that he was ignoring them. Suddenly I understood. My dad had seen the Norwegian Sky. He wasn't going to let terrorists use the Tiny Dancer to blow it up. He'd die first. The rest happened fast. The patrol boat pulled up about 100 yards from the Tiny Dancer. I could see someone shouting into a bullhorn while two other men pointed rifles. A gunshot was fired from the Tiny Dancer toward the patrol boat. Right then my dad jumped one of the men. As the two of them scuffled on the deck, the other man clambered below. My father grabbed the man he was fighting, spun him around, and hit him hard in the stomach and then again in the face. The man reeled backward and fell off the boat into the Sound.